Radio is the next medium that we'll be talking about with our for this particular exam. Radio, if you can definitely say two things about it. First, it's a survivor. Radio will have the new media eventually thrown at it. It will be a medium that becomes very popular, and then it will face that juggernaut that tends to be television, like all the media do as television develops. But radio tends to survive, and part of this may be because of its portability. It can be taken pretty much anywhere, and some of the technology we'll look at will explain how and why it can be it's so portable. But the other important thing is radio is really the first mass medium. And the idea of simultaneity that is not just a few people, but hundreds, thousands, even millions of people actually experiencing the same event on radio at the same time. This is really what makes it the first true mass medium. Individuals read newspapers, individuals read books, individuals listen to music. You can sell millions of records, but individuals are going to listen to those records at their own pace and their own times. Radio is the first real mass medium because millions of people are experiencing the same programming at the same time. So it really is the first true mass medium. What we're going to look at is 6 different things, and so this PowerPoint is going to be divided up into 6 different parts. First, the early technology, then early radio stations, which tend to pop up in people's homes, and then the development of early programming, and where that early programming comes from really are the early networks. Then as the technology becomes more prevalent, legislation that is adopted to regulate radio and eventually broadcasting generally. Then we'll look at radio today and how it's changed, and then as we have with other media issues and controversies related to radio. First, we need to look at a couple of terms, and one of them you're already familiar with. That is patents. We've talked about patents with respect to film and the fact that Edison formed a patent company, a patent monopoly, in order to control the technology that he and others had developed. A patent is a grant by the government for the creator of a technology, of a particular invention, to have the sole right to make, use, and sell that invention for a set period of time. So what Edison was doing is he had developed the film camera, the film projector. Eastman developed celluloid film, and so together they basically controlled the manufacture of that equipment, the use of that equipment, in order to make money off of that equipment. And anybody who violated that could be liable to a lawsuit. But of course, Edison and the patent company had a more ruthless way of dealing with those who didn't follow the rules and pay the fees for the patents. Patents are going to be important in radio technology, as 3 companies who have primarily the majority of the patents related to radio technology, how they sort of come together. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another term is broadcasting. Now, you've probably heard me use this term a lot in class, and it is something that is you may have heard a lot but it has a specific meaning, and it is important to understand that meaning because in our wired societies today, broadcasting is different from being wired. Broadcasting is basically the transmission of a signal into the air for capture by anybody with a receiver. It's a terminology that comes from agriculture. After humans ended their nomadic days of kind of traveling around, following animal herds, which were their primary sources of food, humans tended to congregate in specific places and stay there. And in order to find food, they would have to grow it. And so they would till plots of land, and then they would broadcast the seeds. Basically, they would just throw them up into the air, and wherever those seeds landed, that's where they would grow. And so the term broadcasting comes from that agricultural meaning of throwing signals into the air, and then anyone who has a receiver can actually capture that signal if they have a receiver that can pick up that frequency. And this will be particularly important as we start talking about wireless telegraphy. And it's important to know the idea of, or the terminology of broadcasting, because it is different from cable casting. Cable casting, broadcasting is sending the signal out into the air, whereas cable casting is sending the signal from one fixed point to another fixed point through wires. This is what telegraph is, and this is what early telephone is. That is, you're creating a signal at one end, it goes through the wires to another end. Cable television is just this way. The cable company gets the programming, and then they send it along the cable into your home, into your converter, and then the converter takes that signal and turns it into a signal that goes into your television that you can watch. So the difference here is that cable casting is sending signals through wires from one fixed point to another. Broadcasting is sending the signal out into the air for anyone with a receiver to capture. So radio is really a combination, again, kind of like Gutenberg's press. It's really a combination of technologies. It isn't one big development. It isn't one big discovery. It is technologies that have developed individually and then being put together, and that becomes radio. So the telegraph, which is sending signals through wires, a wireless telegraph, which is sending signals through the air, and then the telephone, which was sending words and sounds through wires. A combination of those is what radio actually has its roots. So we start with telegraphy, or the telegraph. The telegraph primary inventor is Samuel Morse. Morse is actually an interesting character because he is an art professor at Harvard University. But he is interested in sending, how do we send long distance messages from one place to another? And what Morse comes up with is the telegraph. What he does is finds an electrical source, and with that source, that electrical signal goes into this machine, this little thing here, which is called the key. Really, what's happening is with the key, if you look in the in that middle knob right there, you'll see a little space between the bottom of that knob and then the other terminal that's on the piece of wood there. What happens when you push down the key is that it closes the circuit, meaning it sends an electrical current through the wires. and then when you lift up on the key, it puts a space there, and so breaks that current. So as you are tapping on it, you are basically sending electrical impulses through the wire from one place to another. And as you do that, you are sending messages. What kind of messages are you sending? You're sending Morse code. So what Morse is doing is he's finding a way of sending electrical pulses through the wires from one place to another, but he's doing it according to a particular code that he has invented. And each letter in English has a particular combination of dots and dashes, and then the person on the other end interprets those dots and dashes into letters, and then the message is available to whomever it's being sent. The primary effect here is speed. What the Morse code and what the telegraph did was allow for messages to go out in minutes, as opposed to letters that may take weeks, even months, to go from one part of the country to the other. With the telegraph, with someone on one end, the encoder, the telegrapher, sending a message from one side, from one place to another, hundreds, thousands of miles away, that message gets there in minutes, as opposed to weeks or months. And really the biggest problem that Morse had in developing this technology is having enough power, electrical power, that the signals could go a long way, or having some sort of a booster or translator, what's called a repeater, that as the signal goes to a certain mileage, goes a certain distance, there is another power source there to amplify that sound again to make it go even further. That was really the biggest problem for Morse to solve, is basically having large enough batteries in order to send the signal from one place to another without the signal eventually dying out. There are basically three limitations to the telegraph. First, it needs those wires. One of the great accomplishments of technology during the 1800s in this country was the laying of these telegraph wires from one end of the country to the other. Also, laying of telegraph wires across the ocean, connecting the United States with Europe and other countries in the Pacific as well. This cable had to be laid, and it had to be laid onto the bottom of the ocean, so that these signals could be sent from point to point. So it took a lot of ingenuity to find cable, to manufacture cable that was strong enough and durable enough to take on these difficult conditions. A second limitation is that it can't carry sound. It can only carry the electrical current, those dots and dashes that go from one point to another. Voices couldn't be sent from one place to another, or sounds like music or other types of sounds couldn't be sent from one point to another either. Only the dots. The third limitation here was there needed to be someone on each end of the wire who understood the code, the Morse code language. For someone to send a message, they would have to bring that message into a telegraph office. The encoder would take the message and translate it into the dots and dashes. The signal would go through the wire, and then on the other end would be a decoder, somebody who would again interpret back to the alphabet those dots and dashes, and then that message could be written out and then delivered to whoever that message was intended for. So that's the telegraph. That's the first part of early radio, the sending of signals through wires from one place to another. But then the question became, how can you do that without wires? Certainly the difficulty of laying cable across an ocean or across a sea of some sort was difficult in itself. Is there a way that we could send messages through the air? The biggest problem here were ships at sea. Ships, once they left the port, they may not have any contact with any land or any other ship unless they ran across them in the sea lanes, simply because there was just no way you can't lay a cable from your ship to land. So the question was, how can technology be developed that send those same coded signals through the air? The guy who really discovered the methodology of doing this was a scientist named Heinrich Hertz. What he discovered was that you can actually send signals through the air on what's known as a carrier wave. And this was because there are things in the air called electromagnetic waves. These waves are everywhere. They're different types of waves. There are sound waves, there are light waves, there are gamma waves, and all of them are dependent on the strength of those waves. And once you send a signal or send a wave, a current through the air, you can attach signals to that carrier wave that can power a telegraph key on the other end, and then messages can be sent through the Morse code. His discovery then actually led to wireless telegraphy. The fact that you could actually, using a carrier wave, send messages from one place to another. Ships could put up antenna in the ships, and then they could capture those signals from that antenna down into the wireless boxes, receivers, and interpret that code. The guy who did this the most was the man who is often given credit for inventing radio, and that is Marconi. Marconi didn't actually invent radio. What Marconi did was take the technology that was there and combine it and put it together. And three things came out of this. He takes the technology of Hertz and he takes the technology of Morse and puts them together, and basically is the one who discovers or puts into practice the fact of wireless telegraphy. That is, sending a carrier wave through the air and then attaching messages, coded messages through the air on that carrier wave. He was the first, and what he was doing, second thing he did was to do it over long distances. Again, with the telegraph, you had to have a repeater, something after a certain distance through wires. Electricity eventually slows down and isn't as strong. And so you need a kind of an amplification to continue the signal through. What Marconi developed was technology that amplified the signals strong enough so they could go without amplifiers in the middle. And he did this by taking on the Cornwall coast of England, he set up a transmitter, and then he sent a ship out to sail towards America, And as the ship was sailing, his crew would send messages to the ship and determine the strength of those messages and to see how far the signal would go, how far the power of each signal would go. And so he was the one who really kind of developed that enough power to go wirelessly from Europe to America. And then the third thing that he did, and this is probably why he's so well known with respect to radio technology, is that he marketed it. He found a way to take this technology and sell it to others. What he did was first get patents in Britain and for his company that he created. And then he went to America and founded the American Marconi Company. What this company did was companies would come to him. They would want to have a kind of a department that could send messages from one place to another through the air, and so he would sign up telegraphers to they would work for that company, but they actually worked for the Marconi Company. They were his employees, but they would send messages for these different companies. And particularly important were shipping companies. As I said, ships at sea really, prior to this, had no communication with land or other ships unless they came across these other ships through the shipping routes. And so something could happen to a ship and no one would hear about it until it became clear that that ship wasn't docking when it should. And so, there would be an effort to go and find that ship. So having this kind of connection for a ship that was at sea, a connection to either other ships or land. And again, shipping companies could now keep track of their ships, where they were, how far they may out be from port. And then but again, the telegraphers, even though they were on the ships, they were being paid by the Marconi Company. And this was going to be very important, particularly with respect to the Titanic. If you remember, the Titanic in April of 1912, in its maiden voyage from Britain to the United States, hit an iceberg and sank. The telegraphers that were on the ship worked tirelessly to try and connect to other ships that might be in the area, and they did actually get in contact with a ship that was coming to their rescue, but unfortunately the time that it would take this ship to get there, I believe it was called the Caledonia, was about 4 hours. And the problem is that the ship was sinking and would be gone in about an hour and a half. The major tragedy here is that there was another ship that was only 10 miles away from the Titanic that could easily have come and rescued many of the passengers who eventually perished. However, the ship basically had gone to sleep. The telegrapher had turned off the equipment, turned off the receivers, and wasn't getting any messages. So the ship wasn't getting any messages. The crew on the Titanic tried to send up emergency rockets, and the crew on the California, which was the ship 10 miles away, thought that it was just some sort of celebration. They could see the lights. They could see the lights of the Titanic, but thought nothing was wrong. And so this would eventually lead to legislation related to operation of ship radios in the future. But again, with wireless telegraphy, like the telegraph, there were certain limitations with wireless telegraphy. First, again, it could not transmit sound. It could not transmit voices. It could only transmit the signals, the electrical current, those dots and dashes of the Morse code. And again, just like wireless or wired telegraphy, there needed to be an encoder and a decoder on either end of the message connection. Someone had to be there to create the message, to send the message, and someone had to be there to interpret the message. So the third technology is the telephone, and the telephone is something that, and we'll find this in a couple of other medias, is that it wasn't just the United States that was working on this kind of technology. Other countries around the world had their scientists working on telephonic technology as well. That is sending sounds through wires, sending the human voice through wires. The man who is credited with inventing this technology in the United States is Alexander Graham Bell. Bell is a man who is interested in, who worked a lot with deaf people, deaf children, trying to teach language to those who had hearing impairments. What he is interested in with the telephone is something that will send the voice and sounds through wires, and eventually his patent will not only be important to communication in the United States, but again, it will, by laying wire across the Atlantic Ocean, will also make for telephonic communication from one country to the next. And this is really the last part of what the world was looking for. There was the telegraph, there was signals being sent through the wire, and then wireless telegraphy, which is signals being sent over the air, but only signals. This was finally the last part that was needed to create wireless sound going through the air into a receiver somewhere down the line. The biggest problem with all of this is that now that you have sound, and now that you have voices that can be the technology to send voices through the air, the question is power. How do you, because in order to send signals are one thing. Just opening and closing a circuit is sending current through the wire. Sending voices, on the other hand, requires a much more powerful signal because, again, voices are more complicated than signals because they have changes in pitch, changes in volume, and so there needed to be something that could really generate the amplification to be able to send voices through the air. And this came with the invention of the Audion tube. The Audion tube is basically what we would refer to today as a vacuum tube. It has wires in a glass encasement, and that encasement has the air pumped out of it so that the power that goes through those wires will not burn the wires out, because it needs a lot of power to go through the wires, and eventually the more power that goes through, the the more those wires are going to heat, the more that they are going to they're going to have stress on them, and they could actually break or burn out. Taking air out of that encasement minimizes that, so you can generate more power, and it's with this power that voices can more easily be amplified over distances without wires. So what actually happens here with the Audion tube is you're now finding a way that can you can take a sound and make it louder, and therefore sending it longer distances with more power, and that it can be picked up on a receiver somewhere else. Now there is some controversy as to who actually invented the Audion tube. The man given credit officially is a man named Lee DeForest. Lee DeForest worked for Westinghouse. He had a number of patents related to communication equipment that he received working for Westinghouse. And he was a very litigious individual. In other words, he sued a lot of other people over patent infringement. The argument is that, by some, is that Lee DeForest actually stole the idea of the Audion tube from another man. That man is Reginald Fessenden. Fessenden, according to some people, had developed the Audion tube. He'd made schematic drawings about the tube, and that Lee DeForest, at one time when he visited Fessenden, saw these drawings and somehow copied them and made and then applied for patents for the Audion tube, and was officially given the recognition and awarded the patents for the Audion tube. What is interesting here, though, is that Fessenden still developed the tube and put it in his transmitting equipment, and actually had his own made a history-making event in 1906. Fessenden had built a transmitter on the coast of North Carolina, and decided to try to broadcast his voice out into the air on Christmas Eve of 1906, and so he did. And the stories are told that on ships out in the Atlantic, that on Christmas Eve of 1906, those who were still on duty suddenly heard a voice in their headsets, something they had never heard before, and were totally stunned by this, and some of them even thought that, it being Christmas Eve, thought that it might be the voice of God talking to them. But even though DeForest is given the recognition and the patent for developing the Audion tube, Fessenden is the first to actually broadcast his voice in a radio fashion in 1906. Another person involved in the development of radio technology is a man called Edwin Armstrong. As we'll see later, Armstrong is one of the more tragic figures in this advancement of technology. He's also considered by many historians of radio technology and sound engineers, considered one of the more underappreciated personalities in the development of this technology, because much of what radio is today in modern times, the technology was developed by Armstrong, even though technically he's not given credit for it. What Armstrong did was took Lee DeForest's Audion tube, vacuum tube, and he improved it. He was a student at Columbia University. He was involved in electrical engineering. And what he did was he took the Audion tube. It was still had the deficiency of not really having enough power to send sound long distances. And what Armstrong did was take that technology and apply what is called regeneration. That is kind of taking a little bit of the feedback signal from the tube and regenerating it, putting it back into, and with each regeneration that increases the power and therefore increases the amplification and the signal. Therefore, the signal itself becomes much stronger, and it takes less effort less energy to send the same signal further, and again, including voices and sounds. Armstrong applied for a patent and received a patent in 1914. However, Lee DeForest challenges Armstrong's patent. Lee DeForest is working for AT&T at the time, and of course AT&T puts all of its legal power behind DeForest. So eventually DeForest wins the lawsuit simply because of the fact that he has more lawyers on his side and who can make more arguments. And consequently, again, Lee DeForest is given the credit for this increased amplification, this increased regeneration, instead of Edwin Armstrong, who actually really knew the technology. There are some who argue that Lee DeForest, even though he won the lawsuit, didn't know how the regeneration concept worked, and that he won only because AT&T was behind him in the lawsuit effort. During World War I, development of radio technology is kind of put on hold. The U.S. government determines that all technology related to radio communications is going to be controlled by the U.S. government, and specifically the Department of the Navy. So all patents related to radio technology are put under the control of the Department of the Navy, and any sort of amateur radio stations, radio transmitters are banned from broadcasting. The idea is that the U.S. government didn't want this technology or any new technologies developed during this time to fall into the hands of the Germans during World War I. After World War I, the control continues to a certain extent. A rule is adopted by the Congress that no foreign persons or foreign originated groups could own more than 25% of an American broadcasting company. What this meant is that Mr. Marconi, who was of Italian extraction and still had an Italian citizenship, had to sell his ownership of the company that he founded, American Marconi. I remember Marconi's wireless telegraphers were working for many companies around the country and around the world, for that matter, and particularly in the shipping industry. So Marconi basically sold off his company and went to Britain. The United States government was still concerned about controlling radio technology and keeping what was developed within the United States in the United States. So what it allowed for is the control of this company or of this technology to be in the hands of only a few U.S. corporations. Eventually, what's created is what's called a patent pool. Three main companies were involved in the development of communication radio technology, and those were AT&T, General Electric, and Westinghouse. What was created was a company known as the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. What they did was they were simply a patent company. All the patents that were owned by AT&T, Westinghouse, and General Electric were put into one pool. And this pool was controlled by RCA. What RCA did was they basically administered the pool. They anybody who wanted to use the technology that came under the patents, they would have to get RCA's permission first, or they would have to pay the royalties, and those payments would go to RCA, and then RCA would distribute the royalties to the individual companies according to the technology that they developed. What RCA could not do is they couldn't become their own manufacturing and distribution company. They could not manufacture equipment, meaning they couldn't make transmitters, they couldn't make receivers, they couldn't make radios, and they couldn't operate or own any radio stations. Unlike AT&T and GE and Westinghouse, who could do both of these things. They can manufacture their own equipment, and they could own and operate radio stations. The creation of RCA had a couple of effects. First was standardization, meaning that all the equipment that was advanced, all the equipment that was built by RCA, or built by Westinghouse, GE, and AT&T, was all standardized. General Electric primarily made the receivers. Westinghouse made receivers. Both those companies made radios, and radio, not only entertainment radios, home radios, but also military radios, police and emergency radios, those kinds of things. And AT&T primarily made transmission equipment. So anybody who wanted to start a radio station would buy the AT&T transmission equipment, and then it would be the signals that were generated by the AT&T transmission equipment could be received by the General Electric and Westinghouse receivers. So what this made for is much easier standardization. Both the transmission of signals and the reception of signals was compatible, because the three companies that were making them so that there was compatibility between the equipment. The second effect was that any technology that had been developed in the United States and any new technologies that were going to be developed over the next several decades were going to stay here in the United States. They weren't going to be used in other countries. They weren't going to be allowed to be sold to other companies. And of course, this had a kind of military backing to it, so that any new radio technologies might fall into the hands of governments that were opposed to the U.S. or aggressive governments. No, that all stayed in the United States and stayed under the control of the U.S. government. So that's a look at early technology as it developed. The next segment of this PowerPoint will be a look at early radio stations that were popping up around the country.